Hey guys, tonight we're going to turn a dark page in history where the great King of England, Henry VIII, transformed himself into a monster of greed and excess. Forget the image of a mighty prince, because by the end of his life, he had become a colossal mass of flesh, a mobile prison that trapped his own soul. Henry's passion for food wasn't just a habit, it was a rabid addiction, a bottomless black hole that swallowed everything in its path. He no longer ate, he devoured. Dozens of roasted suckling pigs, hundreds of grilled quails, and torrents of wine that flowed like waterfalls all vanished into that insatiable maw. His body swelled to a horrifying size, his skin became coarse, and excess fat sagged. The magnificent suits of armor he once wore no longer fit, and new ones had to be specially made, larger than for any other person. His weight surpassed all human limits, to the point that wooden chairs would break under his bulk. Ultimately, a crude contraption, a mechanical elevator, had to be built just to move him up and down the stairs, a pathetic and terrifying sight. Was obesity the only cause? Or were there other vile diseases and infected sores that were slowly eating away at the once glorious king? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're tuning in from somewhere around the globe, drop your city and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Night fell over the vast Tudor hall, the flickering torchlight dancing across the gold-embroidered tapestries, and the rich scent of roasting venison hung heavy in the air. From the far end, with measured stride and regal poise, emerged the young Prince Henry. His broad shoulders filled the ornate doublet as though it had been fashioned expressly for him. His waist, still slender in these first years, hinted at the athletic vigor that would one day become legend. Every nobleman and serving boy alike turned to watch his approach, their eyes drawn to the flame-kissed glint of his reddish-gold hair, the confident tilt of his chin, and the proud set of his limbs, an ideal of Renaissance youth made flesh. Born in 1491, as the second son of Henry Tudor, soon to be King Henry VII, Henry had been groomed from infancy for excellence. In the shadow of his elder brother Arthur, Duke of Cornwall, he received the finest education money could procure. Lessons in Latin and Greek, instruction in statecraft alongside the subtleties of courtly etiquette, and a rigorous regimen of swordplay under the stern gaze of experienced masters. Music tutors taught him the lute and the harp, so that by his early teens he could coax a melancholy melody from carved strings as movingly as any wandering bard. And each morning before dawn, he donned leather gauntlets and strapped on a helmet to practice jousting, the thunder of horse hooves echoing against the stone walls. All of this careful preparation, however, seemed merely the overture to the tragedy awaiting the Tudor line. In the autumn of 1502, young Arthur fell ill and died, leaving Henry barely 12 years old to inherit the mantle of heir apparent. The court erupted in shock and sorrow, but also in a fresh wave of expectation. The boy whose lively laughter once belonged to a younger brother must now assume the weight of an entire kingdom. Though grief still haunted the faces of the courtiers, they straightened their backs, refastened their doublets, and whispered urgent prayers that this gentle, golden-haired prince would prove worthy of the crown. By April of 1509, Henry VII himself passed away, and 15-year-old Henry, scarcely out of boyhood, ascended the throne as Henry VIII. Across England, bells rang in joyous peals, while foreign ambassadors dispatched urgent dispatches back to their monarchs. Behold, a new king rises, tall and vigorous as a stag. Yet amid the jubilation, a few cautious voices offered warnings. A ruler so young, so untested, might prove reckless in matters of war and diplomacy. But their concerns were quickly drowned by the roar of celebration. Bonfires lit the night sky, minstrels tuned their lutes, and the throngs poured wine-dark ale into goblets that clinked like thunder in the streets. At court, Henry greeted his new status with both solemnity and delight. He towered over most of his nobles, his height at least 6 feet, an extraordinary stature in an age when the average man stood barely 5'6". His skin was fair, his cheeks ruddy as fresh fruit. Poets of the day described his smile as a sudden dawn, capable of brightening the gloom of even the grandest hall. He spoke fluently in 6 tongues: Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, Welsh, and Flemish. so adeptly that ambassadors often forgot they were not addressing a seasoned diplomat but a monarch newly come of age. In his hand he held a polished rapier, its steel blade flashing as he parried and riposted, and his skill in the tilt-yard was already becoming the stuff of myth. Yet Henry's early reign was not merely a pageant of youthful pageantry. He understood that a king's image must be built with as much care as his policies. From the outset he declared his intention to restore the grandeur of the crown. Castles were refortified, heraldry renewed, and the royal wardrobe swelled with brocades and velvets in rich reds and deep blues. Royal feasts took on a new theatre. 14 courses could arrive in a single sitting, each more sumptuous than the last swan glazed with saffron. Peacock paraded in its plumage, venison spiced with ginger and nutmeg imported from distant shores. Guests would bow, waiting in hushed reverence for the king's signal before tucking in. Henry presided at these feasts as though he stood at the centre of a mighty engine, each whispered compliment and careful nod a gear in the vast machinery of power. In 1510, Henry wed Catherine of Aragon, widow of his late brother Arthur, forging an alliance with the mighty Spanish crown. The marriage, celebrated with solemn mass and glittering banquets, seemed certain to secure England's future. Yet in the decade to follow, Catherine would bear him several children who did not survive, leaving only Princess Mary to fill the cradle. Each miscarriage was a blow not just to Henry's heart, but to his very sense of divine favour. In the eyes of most contemporaries, a king without a male heir risked divine disapproval and dynastic collapse. Under the strain of this anxiety, he turned with increasing fervour to courtly spectacle. Lavish gifts for noble favourites, tournaments staged with unparalleled extravagance, and a private table where he indulged in spiced wine and sugared confections until the candles burned low. By the soft glow of candlelight and the distant hum of lute strings, Henry VIII at 17 embodied the hope and splendour of a kingdom reborn. Yet beneath his confident gaze lay the seeds of a far darker journey. The search for male succession that would ignite schisms in church and state, the appetite for pageantry that would swell into gluttony, and the ruthless exercise of power that would come to define his reign. As he stood in that glittering hall, robed in crimson velvet and iron resolve, the future of England and of Henry himself balanced on the edge of a dagger's blade, waiting for the first drop of blood to tip the scales. Night fell over the vast Tudor hall, the flickering torchlight dancing across the gold-embroidered tapestries, and the rich scent of roasting venison hung heavy in the air. From the far end, with measured stride and regal poise, emerged the young Prince Henry. His broad shoulders filled the ornate doublet, as though it had been fashioned expressly for him. His waist, still slender in these first years, hinted at the athletic vigour that would one day become legend. Every nobleman and serving boy alike turned to watch his approach, their eyes drawn to the flame-kissed glint of his reddish-gold hair, the confident tilt of his chin, and the proud set of his limbs, an ideal of Renaissance youth made flesh. Born in 1491, as the second son of Henry Tudor, soon to be King Henry VII, Henry had been groomed from infancy for excellence. In the shadow of his elder brother Arthur, Duke of Cornwall, he received the finest education money could procure: lessons in Latin and Greek, instruction in statecraft alongside the subtleties of courtly etiquette, and a rigorous regimen of swordplay under the stern gaze of experienced masters. Music tutors taught him the lute and the harp, so that by his early teens he could coax a melancholy melody from carved strings as movingly as any wandering bard. And each morning before dawn, he donned leather gauntlets and strapped on a helmet to practice jousting, the thunder of horse hooves echoing against the stone walls. All of this careful preparation, however, seemed merely the overture to the tragedy awaiting the Tudor line. In the autumn of 1502, young Arthur fell ill and died, leaving Henry barely 12 years old to inherit the mantle of heir apparent. The court erupted in shock and sorrow, but also in a fresh wave of expectation. The boy whose lively laughter once belonged to a younger brother must now assume the weight of an entire kingdom. Though grief still haunted the faces of the courtiers, they straightened their backs, refastened their doublets, and whispered urgent prayers that this gentle, golden-haired prince would prove worthy of the crown. By April of 1509, Henry VII himself passed away, and 15-year-old Henry, scarcely out of boyhood, ascended the throne as Henry VIII. Across England, bells rang in joyous peals. while foreign ambassadors dispatched urgent dispatches back to their monarchs. Behold, a new king rises, tall and vigorous as a stag. Yet amid the jubilation, a few cautious voices offered warnings. A ruler so young, so untested, might prove reckless in matters of war and diplomacy. But their concerns were quickly drowned by the roar of celebration. Bonfires lit the night sky, minstrels tuned their lutes, and the throngs poured wine-dark ale into goblets that clinked like thunder in the streets. At court, Henry greeted his new status with both solemnity and delight. He towered over most of his nobles, his height at least 6 feet, an extraordinary stature in an age when the average man stood barely 5'6". His skin was fair, his cheeks ruddy as fresh fruit. Poets of the day described his smile as a sudden dawn, capable of brightening the gloom of even the grandest hall. He spoke fluently in 6 tongues: Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, Welsh, and Flemish, so adeptly that ambassadors often forgot they were not addressing a seasoned diplomat but a monarch newly come of age. In his hand he held a polished rapier, its steel blade flashing as he parried and riposted, and his skill in the tilt-yard was already becoming the stuff of myth. Yet Henry's early reign was not merely a pageant of youthful pageantry. He understood that a king's image must be built with as much care as his policies. From the outset he declared his intention to restore the grandeur of the crown. Castles were refortified, heraldry renewed, and the royal wardrobe swelled with brocades and velvets in rich reds and deep blues. Royal feasts took on a new theatre. 14 courses could arrive in a single sitting, each more sumptuous than the last swan glazed with saffron, peacock paraded in its plumage, venison spiced with ginger and nutmeg imported from distant shores. Guests would bow, waiting in hushed reverence for the king's signal before tucking in. Henry presided at these feasts, as though he stood at the centre of a mighty engine, each whispered compliment and careful nod a gear in the vast machinery of power. In 1510, Henry wed Catherine of Aragon, widow of his late brother Arthur, forging an alliance with the mighty Spanish crown. The marriage, celebrated with solemn mass and glittering banquets, seemed certain to secure England's future. Yet in the decade to follow, Catherine would bear him several children who did not survive, leaving only Princess Mary to fill the cradle. Each miscarriage was a blow not just to Henry's heart, but to his very sense of divine favour. In the eyes of most contemporaries, a king without a male heir risked divine disapproval and dynastic collapse. Under the strain of this anxiety, he turned with increasing fervour to courtly spectacle. Lavish gifts for noble favourites, tournaments staged with unparalleled extravagance, and a private table where he indulged in spiced wine and sugared confections until the candles burned low. By the soft glow of candlelight and the distant hum of lute strings, Henry VIII at 17 embodied the hope and splendour of a kingdom reborn. Yet beneath his confident gaze lay the seeds of a far darker journey. The search for male succession that would ignite schisms in church and state, the appetite for pageantry that would swell into gluttony, and the ruthless exercise of power that would come to define his reign. As he stood in that glittering hall, robed in crimson velvet and iron resolve, the future of England and of Henry himself balanced on the edge of a dagger's blade, waiting for the first drop of blood to tip the scales. Time slipped by like smoke curling from a dying torch, and Henry VIII entered the fullness of his reign, a sovereign whose ambitions stretched far beyond England's rolling hills. No longer content with mere victory in battle, he grasped at power through marriage alliances that rippled across Europe like tidal waves. He compelled the Spanish court to renew their bonds by arranging for his daughter Mary to wed the future Emperor Charles V, binding England to one of the continent's greatest dynasties. He then opened delicate negotiations with France, dispatching emissaries laden with emerald-encrusted goblets and bolts of scarlet cloth, until whispers in the French court spoke of an English golden tide, rising ever stronger. Yet the most dramatic of these unions was the rupture of his own marriage to Catherine of Aragon. After 20 years of devotion, Catherine's failure to produce a living son provided Henry the pretext he sought. He petitioned Pope Clement for an annulment, arguing that marrying his brother's widow violated divine law. When Clement hesitated, torn between Henry's demands and the political clout of Catherine's nephew Charles, Henry did not waver. He declared Rome's decrees void in England, summoning Parliament to an extraordinary session that severed the realm from papal authority and elevated the king to the supreme head of the Church of England. In that colossal act of defiance, Anglicanism was born a national church under Henry's dominion, independent of the Vatican's chains. Amid this upheaval, the Tudor court reached new pinnacles of grandeur. Whitehall and Hampton Court, once modest manors, blossomed into palatial wonders. Brick facades of warm red, punctuated by stone quoins, rose 3 stories high, their roofs sheathed in glazed tiles that caught the sunday. Within, halls stretched out in endless procession, each panelled in oak, carved with heraldic beasts and vaulted with hammer-beam trusses, so high they seemed to touch the midsummer sky. Gardens were laid in precise geometries. Gravel paths, bisected parterres of emerald box hedges, and beds of tulips imported from the Low Countries. Fountains gurgled, hidden channels pumping water to sea-level jets that startled swans into startled flight. Under Henry's patronage, the arts flourished. Sculptors from Florence hewed marble busts capturing every nuance of the king's aquiline profile and square jaw. Poets from Gascony and Provence composed odes to his newfound spiritual supremacy, their verses inscribed in gold leaf on presentation manuscripts. Musicians from Venice taught English composers to blend complex counterpoints with native ballad forms, giving rise to laments and madrigals that echoed softly through candlelit galleries. A generation of Tudor artists grew up believing that England was home to the very heart of Renaissance creativity, and few disagreed. Yet no matter how resplendent the court, Henry's own body grew ever more dilated by opulence. The sumptuous banquets he once relished, 14 courses rich with roasted swans, spiced venison, and sugared desserts, now overwhelmed him. The doublets that had draped his torso like a second skin had to be let out seam by seam. Waistcoats grew panels so large they resembled sails. When he jousted with foreign dignitaries, he sat his steed gamely, but the tilt yard had long since lost its winning edge, now a ritual display rather than a contest of skill. Even courtly dances were reduced to stately promenades, for each turn and bow tested the limits of his stamina. Still, he maintained appearances. Each morning he donned his glittering armour, polished to a mirror sheen, and reviewed the guards on Whitehall Avenue, tossing his head and nodding with the air of conquest. Meanwhile, his desire for a male heir and unchallenged authority drove him to reshape the realm's legal framework. He broadened the remit of the Star Chamber, sending political rivals to its secretive sessions where verdicts were swift and punishments ruthless. He turned his ire on Sir Thomas More, former Lord Chancellor, imprisoned for refusing to concede the king's primacy over church matters, then executed him with a single stroke at the Tower's scaffold. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the Reformation, rose to commanding heights until another ill-fated match raised Henry's displeasure, and Cromwell fell from grace like Icarus, his head rolling into the blood-stained sand. Even Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had crowned Henry and sanctioned his ecclesiastical supremacy, found himself under shadow until his final days. Through these convulsions, Henry bound together the spiritual and the temporal in a single imperial person. He became both monarch and archbishop, lawgiver and high priest, wielding an authority that seemed almost sacrosanct. Yet with each legal innovation, each fiery sermon exalting his divine prerogative, his own vitality ebbed further away. He consumed vast quantities of food in pompous ceremonies. Courses arrived on silver platters, carried by gloved attendants who announced each dish in sonorous tones, yet his appetite did not translate into vigor. His collar rose higher around his throat, his belly bulged over the waistband of his silk breeches, and his ruby signet ring narrowed until it cut into his flesh. In the torchlit corridors of Whitehall, courtiers began to whisper that the king's waist had expanded beyond all precedent. He was the fat king of Tudor feasts, a monarch whose greed for power had echoed his hunger at table. Stripped of the youthful grace that once inspired poets, Henry's figure grew rounder, softer yet no less imposing, for he had mastered the art of sovereign spectacle. Even as infirmity stiffened his joints and breath caught in his chest, he continued the rituals of state, opening embassies, issuing writs, presiding over councils from an ornate velvet throne. He might have been a colossus carved from marble, but beneath the facade beat a heart beleaguered by ambition and a body undone by its own excess. Thus did Henry VIII's reign exemplify the paradox of power. The more he stretched his reach across Europe through treaties, marriages, and church reforms, the more his physical frame contracted under the weight of his own grandeur. In that fragile intersection of glory and decay, he became legend and cautionary tale alike. A monarch who shaped nations and faiths, yet found himself consumed by the very realm he sought to command. In the early 1530s, even as Henry VIII's political and romantic exploits filled the corridors of every court in Europe, he began to sense that his body would no longer respond with the effortless vigour of youth. It was on a crisp January day in 1536 that the turning point arrived. The tilt yard at Greenwich had been bedecked with banners, the royal gallery packed with eager spectators, and the air thick with the promise of spectacle. Henry, resplendent in gleaming armour, mounted his horse with the familiar confidence of a champion, but fate intervened in a heartbeat. The startled steed shied at a sudden shout, lost its footing, and pitched the king headlong. He landed heavily, the full weight of his cuirass pinning him beneath the animal's flailing legs. Though he lived through the accident, the impact ruptured tissues and blood vessels in his hip, setting off a cascade of injuries, internal bleeding, a slowly deepening ulcer, and an infection that would gnaw at his pelvis for the rest of his days. In the weeks that followed, Henry discovered that his resilience was no match for this new torment. Where once he might have shrugged off bruises like a farmer would flick away chaff, now each heartbeat sent fresh waves of agony through his hip joint. The stench of unhealed flesh mingled with the sweet incense of court chapels, a private horror hidden beneath the velvet splendour of Whitehall. His physicians attempted a variety of treatments: draughts of red wine, warmed with thyme, poultices of honey and lily root, leeches applied to the swollen area, but none could stem the infection or fully restore the shattered tissues. With each passing day, the injury calcified into chronic misery. Every step languished in pain, and the king who had once ridden with the wind now required assistance merely to stand. To conceal this decline, the Tudor court unveiled a suite of ingenious contrivances that would soon become whispered legend. Foremost among these was the mechanical stairlift, a system of hidden pulleys and counterweights ingeniously woven into the very fabric of the palace. When Henry needed to ascend to his private apartments, he would be seated upon a carved oak chair, its upholstery a careful match to the surrounding tapestries, and gently hoisted by court attendants operating cranks concealed behind louvered panels. The device emitted a slow, teasing creak as it rose, yet succeeded in sparing the king from each torturous step. Alongside this innovation, his bed in the royal chamber was fitted with hidden levers and pulleys that allowed him to be repositioned, upright or reclined, without the need to roll him over a necessity when a simple turn could open old wounds. And in his private antechamber stood a soft-topped walking cane of polished ebony, hollowed and balanced to bear most of his weight, yet designed to resemble the ornamental staves carried by visiting dignitaries. Thus did the court's ingenuity protect his dignity, even as his body frayed, a triumph of Tudor cunning over the indignities of disease. At the same time, the maze of the king's personal life grew ever more tangled. Anne Boleyn, whose sharp wit had once captivated Henry's heart, fell from favour amid accusations of infidelity and treason. In May of 1536, she was arrested, tried, and executed, her death marking a bitter chapter in the royal annals. The king then married Jane Seymour, whose gentle disposition earned him a son, the future Edward. But joy was fleeting. Jane succumbed to childbirth complications in 1637, her passing leaving Henry a widower once more. He took a Scottish princess, Anne of Cleves, but found her lacking in charm and annulled the marriage in weeks. Next came Catherine Howard, whose flirtations led to her beheading, her young neck meeting the executioner's blade in 1639. Finally, in 1646, he wed Catherine Parr, whose calm intelligence would tend to his final years. But by then the pattern of political marriages had sown more tragedy than alliance. Each union reshaped the fabric of court loyalty, costing noble lives and fracturing once solid alliances. Throughout these personal storms, Henry's physical condition continued its inexorable decline. Gout flared like wildfire in his joints, swelling his hands and feet into bulbous masses. The festering ulcer in his hip refused to heal, its foul discharge a constant companion. Dressing and bathing became ordeals of pain, for even the loosest shirt provoked fresh waves of throbbing misery. Culinary delights that once kindled his appetite now lay cold upon his plate. Even so, the ritual of royal feasting persisted. Dishes paraded in procession, each introduced with solemn announcement. Next, a quail glazed with datils. Next, a tart of sweetmeats in syrup. The courtiers ate on, believing that every morsel consumed by their sovereign reaffirmed his dominance over the realm. In these banquets, Henry found a strange kind of power. Each course, whether sampled or abandoned, was a statement of control. He might nibble at a single bite of venison pâté, then dismiss the remainder with a curt nod, reminding all present that he still held sway over life's simplest pleasures. The yeast-sweetened loaves of court bakers, the gilded pastries shaped like royal crests, none could escape his gaze, his prerogative. In the cracking of crusts and the clatter of plate against pewter, he projected the image of unshakable majesty even as his strength seeped away. Thus, in the twilight of his years, Henry VIII's life became a tapestry of splendor and suffering. The accident at Greenwich had opened a wound both physical and symbolic, and the court's mechanical marvels strove to conceal what the king himself could not deny. His marriages, each a roll of the dice in the high-stakes game of European politics, left hearts broken and heads severed. And through it all, the regal ceremonies, the 14-course feasts, the choral anthems, and whispered prayers offered but a thin veneer over the truth. A monarch once radiant, now constrained by the very innovations he inspired. In that soft, lamplit hush of Whitehall's corridors, the echoes of his glory intertwined with the groans of his pain, weaving the final, tragic stanza of a reign unparalleled in its ambition and undone by the frailty of mortal flesh. From the late 1530s onward, the wound Henry VIII suffered at Greenwich, coupled with the inexorable march of years, robbed him of nearly all mobility. Where once he strode through palace corridors with a warrior's confidence, now he required the gentle support of his valet and a Tudor wheelchair, its wooden wheels groaning on the marble floors. It took 3 or 4 attendants to assist him with every movement, one to lift his bulk into the carved chair, another to steady his trembling arms, a third to turn the crank that propelled him, and sometimes a fourth to clear the path of onlookers. Courtly banquets, however, continued unabated. Long tables still groaned under 14 courses of gilded swan, spiced venison, and sugared confections, but Henry no longer rose to greet each dish. Instead, he sat at the head of the table, draped in crimson velvet and ermine, patiently letting each plate be brought to his side. A cupbearer would first present a thimble-sized sip of wine, held at mouth level for a taste before the rest was poured out for others. A master of ceremony oversaw the slicing of roast meats into bite-sized morsels, ensuring that Henry need not strain or wield a knife. For the king, eating became a slow ritual. A forkful of rich pie here, a spoonful of custard there, each measured by the ticking of distant clocks and the low murmur of court gossip. Though his flesh grew weak, Henry's political will remained unwavering. With a voice still sharp despite the rasp of gout and the laboured breath of age, he issued commands like a seasoned general. Sentences were clipped. Send for Cromwell at once. Seize estates of those who dissent. Proclaim this law across the shires. His courtiers flinched at the echo of his tone, for beneath the regal robes lay the iron nerve of a king who refused to cede authority. Rewards were granted swiftly to those who complied, punishments meted out with equal speed, imprisonments ordered, titles stripped, property forfeit such that the mere whisper of Henry's displeasure kept even the boldest nobles in line. It was during these final years that Henry's psychology merged shame over his infirm body with an insatiable hunger for power. Though obesity and illness rendered him nearly immobile, the paradox of the undefeated giant was woven into his image. Hans Holbein's portrait of 1537 captured him in a defiant stance, hands on hips, chest thrust forward, gaze unyielding despite the fact that the real Henry could not stand unassisted. Copies of this painting hung in every royal residence and embassy, proclaiming an illusion of strength that belied his frailty. This was the genius of Tudor art. To bolster the monarch's mystique, transforming the king's corporeal decline into a political asset. Meanwhile, Henry doubled down on legislative reforms that would endure long after his passing. He pressed an act through Parliament, reaffirming the independence of the Church of England, ensuring no future pontiff could wield authority within his realm. He oversaw the demolition of once proud monasteries, inventorying their lands and treasures for the crown, and rechartering their patronage to bolster the royal coffers. In restructuring the realm's finances, he laid the groundwork for what would become the Royal Navy. Dockyards were expanded at Portsmouth and Plymouth, shipwrights granted exclusive rights, and a standing fleet began to patrol the Channel under the Tudor banner. Back in Westminster Hall, the legal code became more exacting. Officials were vetted for loyalty, minor gentry summoned to attest that no peasant dared to flout royal writ. The Star Chamber prosecuted conspirators and hoarders with unerring zeal, issuing fines and forfeitures that filled the treasury. Thus, England's governance grew both centralised and efficient, though some later whispered that it had sacrificed the liberties once enjoyed by free-born men. Amid these grand reforms, Henry's personal life sank ever deeper into the whirlpool of sickness and despair. Catherine Parr, his sixth and final queen, emerged as the sole, constant companion. She read to him at dawn passages of scripture and psalm and consolation, her voice, a soft counterpoint to the king's laboured breathing. She supervised the ministrations of physicians, ensuring that poultices of comfrey and honey were applied to his festering ulcers precisely at midday, and that his bed was replenished with fresh linen each morning to staunch the odours and soothe his agony. Their relationship was no longer that of ardent lovers, but of patient and caretaker. Yet in the quiet moments, when the court's pageantry fell away and Henry lay propped upon embroidered cushions, a genuine affection bloomed. Catherine's crisp hand would brush back his thinning hair, and Henry, with eyes dimmed by infection and age, would murmur a blessing upon her. In this fragile intimacy, he tasted comfort that no feast or edict could provide. She was the gentle anchor in his storm of decline, the final note of calm before the curtain fell on his extraordinary reign. And so did Henry VIII, once the shining emblem of Tudor might, spend his final years largely confined to a wheeled throne, his decrees carried out by men who trembled at his voice, his image immortalized in guarded portraiture, and his body tended by the grace of a queen whose name would ripple through history as his solace and his chronicler. As the 1540s dawned, Henry VIII's body became a landscape of unending agony. The ravages of gout and chronic ulcers left his limbs swollen, festering wounds, oozing dark fluids that could no longer be concealed by even the finest linen bandages. The stench of infection crept through the corridors, an invisible herald of decay that set servants' nostrils aflame and sent courtiers scurrying past closed doors. In whispered gatherings behind heavy draperies, attendants would speak of the pestilential vapours and recall the faint echoes of the king's laboured sighs. Behind the scenes, a courtier's ingenuity took on a grim new urgency. Chambers were sealed as tightly as a ship's hull, windows barred, and every crack and crevice stuffed with moss and wool. Braziers burned eternally in each room, their charcoal embers glowing red as they consumed bundles of lavender, rosemary and juniper, an aromatic triad meant to purge the air of corruption. Incense of frankincense and myrrh was wafted through secret vents, drifting like ghostly veils in the torchlit halls. Even the tapestries were anointed with scented oils, and cloths dipped in vinegar placed at thresholds. Yet still the stench clung, as if Henry's affliction had seeped into the very stones. None of this stopped him from presiding over the affairs of state. He remained firmly ensconced in his pulley-lifted chair, its wooden gears hidden behind carved oak panels, a throne that ascended and descended at his command. On calmer mornings, he would promise a grand hunting expedition in his favourite deer park, whispering of falcons and coursing greyhounds as though his own limbs had not betrayed him. But each such promise was withdrawn by evening's candle. The huntsman sent away with his horn unused, and the deer continued to graze unhunted in the frosted dawn. At the great board of state, the courtiers gathered in solemn silence. Dishes arrived on silver chargers in the customary procession, each announced by the master of ceremonies. Next, a pottage of capon and barley. Next, a tart of Parmesan cheese. Attendants would cut the meat into dainty morsels, test the heat of sauces with a skilled fingertip, then present the king with the first sample. Henry, draped in scarlet velvet, would lean toward the table, raise a forked pick, and sample with deliberate care. He chewed slowly, each bite a silent judgment. If a dish pleased him, he might nod and murmur an approving word. If not, the plate was whisked away without comment, its absence as telling as any decree. In this ornate ritual, the king's appetite became another instrument of governance. A single raised eyebrow at the seasoning could earn a courtier, a knighthood, or plunge him into disgrace. Between meals, he He devoted hours to composing letters and treatises for his children Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, offering guidance on their education and on the stewardship of the realm. "Remember," he would write, "that a prince must balance mercy with justice." Yet his own handwriting shook with weariness, the parchment creased with countless drafts. He admonished Edward on the proper temperance of a king, yet frequently forgot the very names of his own secretaries, calling Mistress Cromwell Lady Steward, and summoning Sir William Paget to deliver messages meant for the Earl of Hertford. Mistakes abounded. A command to release a prisoner would follow his earlier order to keep the man imprisoned indefinitely, and the hapless official caught in the blur of contradictory mandates would be summoned before the Privy Council to explain himself. This confusion fostered an atmosphere of dread. No one dared question the king, yet all braced for his unpredictable wrath. A single misstep, arriving a moment late to read a dispatch, addressing the wrong noble in a greeting, could invite a torrential burst of fury. Henry's voice, once sonorous and commanding, now cracked with fatigue as he hurled accusations of betrayal and disloyalty. Those who stood in his presence found themselves shrinking beneath his glare, uncertain whether to kneel, bow, or simply remain still. Even in these final years, his hunger for power burned unabated. He pressed his last acts of Parliament to reinforce the king's supremacy over the church and state alike, stamping royal authority onto every corner of the kingdom. Yet each new edict felt inextricably bound to the lament of his failing flesh. The same hands that signed laws banning foreign interference in English affairs trembled as they held quill and ink. His seal, once embossed crisply with the Tudor rose, now bore smudges from careless pressing, testament to weakness creeping into his grasp. In his chambers, where the flicker of candlelight cast long shadows, Henry's figure was both majestic and tragic, a colossus of faded grandeur. Though he could no longer stride into council chambers, his will was enacted with a potency born of fear and reverence. Courtiers whispered that he sat there as an immovable mountain, every breath a rumble, every command a landslide. Some spoke in hushed tones of the sleepless monarch, for Henry dozed fitfully in his pulley, lifted chair, only to jolt awake with a start at the slightest creak in the rafters. And yet, even as his mind faltered and his body wasted away, he was never truly silent. The echo of his voice, issuing orders, decrees, and occasional private prayers, lingered in the empty corridors long after the courtiers had left. In the thick, incense-laden air, one could almost hear him calling for his next meal, his next missive, his next decision, each an assertion of sovereignty against the encroaching twilight of his humanity. In that solemn hush, Henry VIII remained king in every sense, wielding power, even as he lay nearly helpless, a testament to the inexorable union of flesh and throne. By the 40s of the 16th century, Henry VIII's once formidable physique was in precipitous decline after more than 30 years on the throne. In 1543, gout took hold like a viper coiling around his joints, each step sending stabbing pains through his ankles as though struck by red-hot needles. His hands swelled grotesquely, the skin taut and shining. His feet puffed beyond any shoe's comfort, rendering him unable to walk more than a few paces unaided. Yet the Tudor court remained determined to conceal this decay beneath layers of ritual and pageantry. Whitehall and Hampton Court served as the grand stages for nightly spectacles. Long tables were draped in velvet dyed the shade of ripened pomegranates, and 36 courses paraded before the king as though in a festival of culinary marvels. Roast swan, its breast gilded with spun sugar, glowed like a jewel at the table's centre. Peacock, plumed and glazed, spread its elegant tail for onlookers to admire. Even shrimp and rarer still, prawns were dusted in powdered pearls and arranged atop silver platters. Almond pudding in delicate shell moulds bore inscriptions of royal mottos, each dessert accompanied by a minstrel's tale of chivalry or romance. Despite the lavish bounty, Henry's participation had dwindled to a solemn ceremony of acceptance. His food was prepared with exacting care, each morsel cut into tiny squares, left to cool to room temperature, then tested at the tip of a silver fork before being offered to his lips. A single bite would follow strict protocol. He raised the fork with measured grace, placed it gently at the corner of his mouth, and tasted quietly, mindful that any abrupt chew might aggravate an ulcer in his gums. Should the flavour please him, he slightly nodded. Should it fail to meet his exacting standard, The plate was discreetly whisked away and never mentioned again. Beyond the main banquet halls, royal apartments were fitted with ingenious contrivances to support his failing strength. A network of pulleys hidden within tapestry-lined walls lifted him gently from one floor to the next, the so-called Tudor stairlift humming with each upward climb. The device's wooden wheels creaked like slumbering giants as it carried the king through corridors adorned with family crests. Hydraulic-style levers beneath his throne adjusted his posture with a single tug, allowing him to recline without moving a muscle. These innovations, though born of necessity, were cloaked in secrecy, designed to honor the monarch's dignity even as his body betrayed him. Meanwhile, Henry's grasp on power showed no sign of slackening. He issued proclamations at breakneck speed. Loyal bishops were appointed in a single breath, and vast monastic lands were seized to finance his ever-expanding navy and centralized bureaucracy. Under his watchful eye, hundreds of new warships were commissioned, their hulls built to cut through English Channel waves like leviathans. These investments in maritime strength laid the cornerstone for what would become a global naval empire. Yet for all these accomplishments, the burden of taxation crushed the peasantry of Ireland and Scotland. Any hint of rebellion was crushed with force, and small uprisings were quelled with brutal expeditions led by Henry's most trusted captains. In matters of health, the king transformed into the ultimate royal patient. Physicians from Venice, Italy, and England crowded his chambers, each bearing a compendium of treatments. Poultices of comfrey and heather were wrapped around his aching limbs. Leeches were applied in regimented rows to draw off the impurities of gout. Honey and birch resin dressings were pressed into his ulcers in the hope of soothing the rot. Yet each intervention seemed only to exacerbate his suffering, the once ambrosial remedies turning acrid against flesh ravaged by chronic infection. When night fell and the court retired, Henry often drifted into troubled slumber induced by opium-spiked wine and powdered pearls dissolved in distilled spring water. In the hushed darkness, Catherine Parr's gentle voice might whisper prayers of comfort, only to be doused by Will Sommers' acid wit echoing in his dreams. A sudden jest or sharp laugh would jerk him awake, his brittle bones rattling in the pillow as the shadows on the walls stretched and recoiled like silent spectators to his torment. It was a time of paradox, an era of shining banners and gilded feasts, performed for a king who had lost nearly all of his royal vigour. The Tudor court pressed on, upholding traditions of opulence and ceremony, as though they could stave off the encroaching reality of mortality. Each banquet was a ballet of plate and goblet, each decree a thunderbolt of authority. And through it all, Henry VIII remained at the centre of a world he had shaped, his legend fortified by ritual and the hush of courtly awe, even as his body faltered and the final curtain drew inexorably near. Despite his ravaged health, Henry VIII maintained an iron grip on his public image, marshalling court painters, sculptors and poets as loyal chroniclers of his enduring might. When Hans Holbein the Younger died in 1544, his death did little to slow the parade of regal likenesses. The next generation of Tudor artists simply traced Holbein's original sketches, employing stencil-like templates to replicate the king's triumphant stance. In each new portrait, whether rendered in burnished crimson cloak or opulent sapphire mantle, Henry stood with legs planted firmly apart, hands planted on hips, the drape of his velvet robe cascading like a waterfall across the dais. His jaw jutted proudly, his throat, freed from collar seams, was depicted without a hint of the bandages that in reality impeded his swallow. No painter dared reveal the ulcerations at his ankle or the tremor in his posture. These faithful copies were dispatched in sets of a dozen or more to royal embassies across Europe, convincing foreign courts that England's strength knew no diminution. Within the gilded confines of Whitehall, the spectacle extended beyond canvas and marble. Court theatricals became a powerful tool of obfuscation. Shakespeare's history play, Henry VIII, first staged in the mid-1540s, painted the monarch as a figure equal parts majestic and tragic, his regal power undiminished by personal trials. Though the bard himself may have never seen the king's actual decline, his words echoed the carefully curated persona. "Fear not, gentle Henry, they shall not betray you." Likewise, in the great hall at Hampton Court, a wax effigy of the king was displayed on a raised dais. Guests were informed it was an exact likeness, which inspired one visiting Italian actor to remark that though the figure remained stock still, it nonetheless reigned, in place of any living sovereign. Meanwhile, The ritual calendar continued to revolve as though Henry were in robust health. Jousts, mask dances, and courtly jousts were staged with full pomp, even though the king himself could no longer mount a horse or sally forth to tilt. The lists of champions remained unchanged, positioned so that their triumphs would appear as though performed in Henry's presence. Poetry contests and sacred musical offerings proceeded under the banner of His Majesty's Excellence, each performance a testament to the unbroken continuity of court life. Seating plans for ambassadors and councillors were preserved down to the exact foot of distance from the king's seat, ensuring that no visitor would assume any diminishment of status due to the monarch's absence. In this choreography of power, empty space spoke as loudly as any uttered decree. Foreign diplomacy likewise hinged upon this edifice of illusion. When the Spanish ambassador arrived in 1545, he was escorted through a private gallery hung with portraits of Henry in every conceivable hue and garb. Attendants in gold-embroidered doublets bore him through an antechamber where 14 golden stags once stood, now replaced with fluted columns crowned by statues of the Tudors. At the centre of it all, a grand canopy sheltered the king's empty swivel chair, gilded with lions and Tudor roses. A minuet performed by 10 court musicians signalled the ambassador's arrival. Trumpets sounded a royal fanfare, and the guest was presented with a banquet, sectioned off with silken ropes, so that he would dine as though in the king's very presence. He departed with dispatches praising England's immovable majesty, a glowing testimonial that circulated through Spanish, French, and papal courts alike. But behind the velvet curtains, whispers of unease drifted through the privy chambers. A few trusted groomsporter muttered in low voices about the mechanical stairlift hidden under the great dining dais, and about the king's uneven gait when he was steadied to rise. Others confessed to fearing any misstep. No one who crosses him, they said, lives to regret it. Each hush carried weight. To dissent was to flirt with danger, for the king's justice remained swift and absolute, even if delivered from a semi-reclined throne. The very courtiers who feasted on his bounty trembled at the thought of exposing the frailty that lay beneath the painted masks. Thus, the court of Henry VIII in his final years was a theatre of contradiction. Flesh rendered powerless by disease, yet sovereignty proclaimed through artifice. Every painting, every play, every stately ceremony stood as a testament to a determination that refused to bow to mortality. The Tudor court, with its candles eternally alight and its perfumed braziers eternally burning, wove an illusion so seamless that even the keenest observer might believe a king unbowed, so long as one never glimpsed the hidden levers beneath the throne. And in that carefully orchestrated shadow play, Henry VIII secured one final victory over time itself. He lived on, immortalized in splendor, even as his breath grew shallow and his body gave way to the relentless tide of suffering. By the end of 1545, Henry VIII had grown too frail even to speak at length. He lay upon a bed draped in Tudor brocade, limbs bound in linen bandages that stank of infection beneath the floral scents meant to mask the rot. A dozen candles flickered on gilded sconces, their honeyed glow softened by curls of juniper smoke. The air was thick with attempts at concealment. Bundles of rosemary and lavender pressed into tapestries, small braziers stoked with pine and myrrh in one corner, and every shutter closed tight against the chill breeze that might carry odours of decay. At his side sat Catherine Parr, her voice low and gentle as she read from the Psalms. Each verse drifted through the chamber in slow, hushed tones, a lullaby of faith for a man who could no longer find rest. Occasionally she paused to wipe the sheen of sweat from Henry's brow, her damp kerchief pressed lightly against his temple. A drop of candle wax, softened by heat, glimmered on his cheek until she caught it with a white lace handkerchief. The royal physicians moved in and out like anxious shadows. They carried small vials of birch resin, vessels of honey-infused elixirs, and flasks of newly introduced pain medicine. Each remedy was delivered with solemn ceremony. A spoonful of bitter tincture pressed between his lips, a sticky poultice laid on his thigh. Yet each intervention seemed only to deepen his stupor, his breaths growing longer and his eyelids heavier. The honeyed draughts that once soothed his gouted joints now left him listless, adrift between fevered dreams and waking hallucinations. By the 27th of January 1547, Henry had slipped into a profound coma. Courtiers were summoned at once to the royal chamber, their whispered footsteps echoing down candlelit corridors. Lords and bishops gathered in tense silence. glancing toward the curtained door as though expecting the king to rise mid-prayer. Outside the chamber, the hush was absolute. No trumpets sounded, no drums rolled, only the muffled clink of a knight's spur and the distant echo of the guard's shifting boots. Will Summers, the court jester whose antics once brought laughter even to the sternest council, stood off to the side. His motley had been pressed, and his bells silenced. He no longer spun tales of folly. Instead, he removed one white glove, draped it across the back of an empty chair, and muttered with a grim wink, "Not even your sugared comfits can save you now, sire." His words, half jest and half lament, drifted through the room like a sigh. No one laughed. That night, in a rare flicker of awareness, Henry's eyelids fluttered open. His breath came in shallow gasps as he turned his gaze toward Catherine. His voice, cracked by pain and disuse, whispered the words that bridged the great gulf between monarch and man. "I built this realm, now I must depart." He pressed his hand against the silken counterpane as though to steady himself, then closed his eyes with a final, gentle sigh. When morning broke on the 28th of January, the court waited with bated breath. The chamber doors stood wide to admit the pale grey light, but no breath stirred within. In the hush, only the faint rattling of a servant's chainmail broke the stillness. Then, at dawn, the king exhaled his last. His spirit drifted out amidst the mingled scents of mint and beeswax, leaving behind a body at rest on its Tudor-gilded bier. No bells tolled in proclamation, no trumpeters sounded a last salute. Instead, a single set of Westminster church bells chimed the hour, their sonorous peals echoing through London's fog. Within the palace, the courtiers bowed their heads and intoned in unison. "It is done." The phrase rang out, solemn and concise, as though carved into the very stones of Whitehall. Thus ended the reign of Henry VIII, a monarch whose life had been a tapestry of brilliance and suffering. Henry VIII's passing left behind a legacy as tangled as the tapestries that adorned his palaces. Perhaps his greatest and most contentious inheritance was the severing of the English Church from Rome. By casting off papal authority, he set the stage for an independent Anglican communion, a rupture that reverberated across Christendom. Catholic Europe watched with alarm as England declared itself spiritually self-governing, its monarch at the head of a national church. This bold break catalyzed the broader Reformation, each ripple widening fault lines between princes and pontiffs. Equally transformative was Henry's investment in a permanent navy. Ships built in Portsmouth and Plymouth, once mere coastal defenders, swelled into a formidable fleet. By the time he drew his final breath, hundreds of vessels, carracks, and galleons alike patrolled the Channel and beyond. This maritime armada became the bedrock of England's future seaborne empire, enabling ventures into the New World and the assertion of naval supremacy that would flourish under subsequent reigns. In the rolling grey mists of the Channel, Henry's ships stood as silent testament to a kingdom newly confident on water. On the administrative front, the Tudors cemented a more centralised legal framework. The Star Chamber, once an ad hoc tribunal, gained permanent authority to oversee nobles and commoners alike. Royal decrees bypassed local courts, aligning justice with the monarch's will. The resulting bureaucracy, clerks, scribes, and circuit judges extended the king's gaze into every shire and borough. Though this system laid groundwork for absolute monarchy, it also ensured a more uniform application of law, reducing the arbitrary rule of powerful barons. Henry's hand thus reached into every corner of the realm, balancing firm rule with procedural consistency. His three children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, each inherited slices of this complex inheritance. Edward VI, delicate and devout, took the throne at 9, championing the Protestant reforms his father had begun, but refining them with a zeal that unsettled many. Upon Edward's death at 15, Mary I ascended, restoring papal allegiance with fierce determination, persecuting dissenters until she earned the sobriquet Bloody Mary. Finally, Elizabeth I mounted the throne at 25, weaving a via media between faiths. Her Elizabethan settlement solidified Anglicanism, while tolerating certain Catholic rites, fostering a period of cultural flowering and relative stability. Architecturally, the Tudor imprint endures. Hampton Court, with its half-timbered facades and red brick, remains an exemplar of early 16th century grandeur. Its long gallery stretches like an echo of royal promenades, windows framing gardens once tended by Henry's gardeners. Greenwich's palace, though largely rebuilt, still hints at his vision: rusticated stone, steep roofs, and castled battlements that crown the riverbank. These structures stand in quiet testimony to a monarch who believed that stone and timber could proclaim his power long after his flesh failed. In painting, the Holbein style lingered. Even after his death, court portraitists leaned heavily on Holbein's templates. The broad stance, the wind-swept cloak, the unblinking stare. These likenesses, repeated in galleries from Madrid to Warsaw, perpetuated the notion of a king, unmoved by time or infirmity. Holbein's influence seeped into every royal commission, smoothing wrinkles and erasing bandages, so that Henry lived on as an ageless emblem of Tudor dominance. The court's musical life, too, retained echoes of his reign. Lute songs by John Dowland and William Byrd, composed during the late Tudor era, carried the melancholy and majesty of a court that had known both triumph and tribulation. Masques and consort dances held in candlelit chambers revived melodies once performed in Henry's presence, their strings and voice inflections recalling a time when court musicians balanced festive exultation with undercurrents of unrest. Literature, finally, perpetuated his memory. Shakespeare's play Henry VIII, blending history and dramaturgy, cast the fattened monarch as both sovereign and sufferer. Actresses in bejeweled bodices and actors, propped by hidden braces, evoked his larger-than-life presence, even as the playwright hinted at the hidden stairlift and the court's desperate artifice. In modern film and television, documentaries pause to illustrate the king who rode a mechanical stair, dramatizing his physical decline alongside his ruthless statecraft. Thus Henry endures in popular culture as a symbol of power intertwined with tragedy. A man who wielded the axe and the pen, who broke Catholic unity, yet forged a new national identity, and who, in the end, stood enthroned in art long after his breath had fled. And so, the Tudor age pivots on his memory. His reign, now centuries past, still courses through the veins of English identity. The proud Church of England, the Royal Navy sailing into global prominence, and a legal tradition tracing back to a court that believed a king's word was law. In every painted portrait, every battered fortress, every hushed verse of a 16th century madrigal, Henry VIII's complex legacy whispers on an enduring testament to a king who reshaped a nation even as his own body failed him. Immediately after Henry's death, England entered a tumultuous regency. His son, Edward VI, was barely 9 years old when proclaimed king. Yet the true reins of authority rested with a regency council headed by his uncle Edward Seymour. Under Seymour's guidance, Protestant reforms accelerated at breakneck pace. The old Roman Catholic rites were stripped away, Mass was conducted in English instead of Latin, and Martin Luther's writings were translated into the vernacular and distributed widely. Monastic lands and treasures were parcelled out to merchants and landowners, who in turn funded the establishment of grammar schools and infirmaries. This redistribution of wealth fostered a burgeoning middle class, laying economic foundations that would, 2 centuries later, power the Industrial Revolution. However, these extreme religious measures also sowed division. Devout Catholics were branded as rebels, and many priests and lay believers faced public execution. The harsh intolerance eroded the Regency Council's credibility, as once fearful subjects began to chafe under the new orthodoxy. When Edward himself died in 1553, the balance swiftly shifted. Edward Seymour fell from favour, and Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest surviving daughter, claimed the throne. A staunch Catholic, Mary reversed her brother's reforms entirely. She ordered English Protestant Bibles and liturgies burned, restored ties with Rome, and presided over the persecution of her former Protestant subjects. Nearly 300 were burned at the stake in horrific spectacles that came to be known as Mary's Burning, earning her the grim epithet Bloody Mary. Though her reign was brief, it temporarily reasserted Catholic stability in church and state. When Elizabeth I ascended in 1558, she inherited a kingdom fractured by faith. Elizabeth, shrewd and politically adroit, pursued a middle way. She re-established the Church of England, but allowed room for personal conscience, neither forcing Roman rites nor endorsing Protestant extremism. In 1559, her parliament passed the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity, declaring the monarch as supreme governor of the church, while permitting certain Catholic traditions to persist so long as subjects swore allegiance to her as head of the church. This accommodation of divergent beliefs ended the religious bloodletting and ushered in the Elizabethan era, celebrated for its cultural flourishing and relative peace. Beyond matters of faith, Henry VIII's impact on the very structure of English government proved transformational. He dismantled the decentralized feudal order, replacing it with a highly centralized state apparatus. The dissolution of the monasteries enriched the crown's coffers, allowing for standardized taxation across the realm. The Star Chamber and Council of the North extended royal justice into every shire, reducing local magnates' power to dispense law. Henry's bold investment in shipbuilding gave birth to the Royal Navy, which evolved into a strategic force safeguarding England's shores and trade. These institutions he created uniform tax structures, expanded royal courts, and a permanent fleet served as the bedrock of a modern government. Subsequent monarchs may have shifted policy or nuance, but they all inherited an administrative machine far more cohesive than the patchwork of noble jurisdictions that had existed before Henry's reign. His legacy thus stands as a pivotal turning point, marking England's transformation from a medieval kingdom of competing lords into a centralized nation-state under a single sovereign. And so, as the candles flicker ever more softly and the echoes of Tudor footsteps fade into the hush of history, we draw gently toward the close of our tale. Imagine the corridors of Whitehall settling into a hushed lullaby, the tapestries swaying in a barely perceptible breeze, and the last strains of lute music dissipating like morning mist. In these quiet moments we find the true heart of our story, not simply in the thunder of armor or the clash of reform, but in the subtle lesson of endurance and transformation. Henry's life, with all its grandeur and pain, reminds us that even the mightiest among us must learn to adapt when the body grows weary, that the spirit can forge new paths when old certainties crumble, and that legacy is born not only in monuments of stone, but in the tender echoes of change that shape the world long after one's final breath. In this gentle reflection, we discover a value still precious and profound: the courage to face our own shifting seasons with dignity, to weave together hope and humility as the threads of a quieter victory. Now, let your mind's eye drift away from gilded courts and echoing halls, and allow the soft contours of the present moment to take their place. Feel the weight of the day lift from your shoulders, as if carried away on the gentle current of a slow-moving stream. In the stillness, you are free to breathe deeply, to savor each exhale as a whispered promise of peace, and each inhale as a tender caress of renewal. As the imagery of kings and kingdoms recedes, may you find comfort in the knowledge that every story, even one filled with splendor and sorrow, ultimately unfolds in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. And in those spaces, we rest, we grow, and we dream of what tomorrow might bring. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be soft and full of gentle wonder, and may you awake renewed and ready to greet the new day. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, please subscribe to our channel so that, together, we can wander once more through history's grand tapestry, discovering the most beautiful and remarkable stories yet to be told. Sleep well, and until we meet again, whispers of tomorrow's tales will linger just a click away.